Welcome to the show, Irka and Eugene.
Lovely to be here.
So psyched for this conversation.
Us too. We've been having little side chats, like just preparing for this, and so many fun conversations.
Yeah, great. We're going to talk about polyamorous relationships, open relationships, and how you're doing your version of this really well, what you call it, what are the other names, et cetera. We're going to get into that. But first, just so the listeners have a sense of who you two are, can you introduce yourselves a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. My name's Eugene. I'm 42 years old. Originally an immigrant kid from the former Soviet Union. Actually, I was born in St. Petersburg, Russia. I now, at this point, have to disclose that Irka is Ukrainian because she's now my state. I have to say that every time I say I was born in Russia.
Yeah.
But yeah, grew up mostly in Brooklyn. Had a fairly regular upbringing for a poor immigrant kid. Ended up doing finance and building financial technology companies. Did some investment and kind of came to this non-monogamy thing very kind of slowly together with Irka, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a lot of detail, but it's kind of been one of the, the relationship is in many ways one of the things I'm most proud of in life. And getting here has definitely taught us a lot. And so, in fact, kind of over the years, Irka and I have both gotten into coaching as well. We do, Irka is kind of her core job is coaching people. And we together also do some, couples coaching, both for monogamous and non-monogamous people. And so these are topics that we are excited to geek out on with you because we're always excited to geek out about them.
Yeah.
Yes. One of our favorite things to talk about.
Cool. But
Thanks.
Irka, I'll kind of hand it over to you.
Yes. Hi, I'm Irka. And I spent a decade on Wall Street. I used to work for Goldman. I traded oil options at some point. I ran a startup incubator, started a bunch of companies, sold some startups. And then at some point, through a lot of therapy and a lot of healing work, came to the realization that my purpose is to help adults heal. And so for the last few years, that's what I've been doing. I work with a lot of people who've done everything in life that they thought was right. And I'm putting right in air quotes. Everything that society told them would bring them happiness and satisfaction, but they didn't quite get there. And they wake up in their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s and they go, this isn't working. And they often find their way to me somehow. And we figure out what patterns do they need to shed in order to live a meaningful, fulfilling, beautiful life. So that's what we do now. And polyamory is obviously a part of that. And non-monogamy is obviously a part of that for some people.
Yeah. So cool. Thank you. Fascinating. Ukrainian, Russian here, immigrants, given what's going on in the world. And there's a third. How would we like to talk about the third in the relationship today? How do you guys want to do that?
Yeah. So the third, his name is James. And so Eugene and I have been together for 20 years. I'm 41 this year. We started dating when I was 21. Though we pretended we weren't dating for the first year. We were in deep denial about the level of commitment we had for each other. And it worked for us at the time.
Even at a point when you were already living with me, we were like, no, we're not dating.
Yes.
Just living together, but definitely not dating.
Yeah, we had some commitment issues, especially me in the beginning. And James came into our lives about 8 years ago. And so Eugene and I have been non-monogamous in various ways, very loosely in the beginning, much more intentionally later on, the entire 20 years. And when James joined us, and he's way more intentional about his relationships than Eugene and I, about 8 years ago. And so the three of us have been a throuple, which is what we call ourselves. I think it's a term we borrowed from Dan Savage, a throuple together for the last 8 years.
You called it a truple?
Throuple.
A throuple? Yeah.
A throuple or a truple?
Throuple.
Throuple, okay.
TH.
Three, couple, got it.
Yes.
People, kind of couple. People use triad sometimes, but I don't know. Something about throuple means
Throuple.
Yeah.
Okay.
feels better to
Sounds
us.
close enough to couple, I suppose.
Yeah.
You
All
end
right.
up making up a lot of names and choosing a lot of names when you start going kind of the more socially unconventional route. A lot of definitions that haven't been set in stone. So we go with throuple.
Awesome. And just for context for the listener, I've known Eugene many years now. I don't know, 7 years or something. We've been in a business mastermind for quite a while, and we see each other every so often. And we've gotten into this conversation a little bit, in addition to other wild conversations about like fiction books and human beings and etc. And I, for years, have been like really, really inspired, Eugene, by how you talk about Irka and James and your relationship. And every year you're still together, still trucking along. And so being a monogamous guy, I'm very suspicious of people in quote open relationships, partly because I'm often cleaning up the mess from that. And I hear so many fallout stories, and there's a lot of woo-woo spiritual types here in Boulder that do that, but they're like kind of preying on people. And there's a lot of hurt. And people get very confused. So it's so cool to have what I see as a high functioning, healthy throuple here, because I think a lot of people can learn from you guys. So I just wanted to lay that down here for people. So I'm just psyched to get into it here. So why don't we start with like how you define the terms of your relationship, so people know, because there's open relationships, there's poly, there's non-monogamy, there's monogamish, there's like, give us a sense of the landscape here and what you've arrived at and why it works for you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because definitions and terms really matter. And we, at this point, call ourselves polyamorous because there's a lot of love and deep connection. And it's probably the closest term that we have to something that's like we think of ourselves as forever until we're told otherwise, effectively. And we're so committed. We're currently building a house together, which I think is one of the craziest commitments even a couple can make together. Like the three of us purchased land and we're building a whole new house on it. It's crazy.
To give your listeners a little bit of maybe context that they, some of them may or may not have. So the E&M, or ethical non-monogamy, is kind of, let's say, the umbrella term for what most people think of as like open or some form of open, basically for non-monogamous relationships, right? And that's kind of ethical non-monogamy. And then polyamory ends up being a subset of that, with kind of like the core defining aspect of polyamory is usually the fact that, well, many amory loves. If James would hear, he would rant nonstop that this is an abomination of a word which combines Greek and Latin and should have never been born. But that being said, the idea is, and this is what Irka was referring to, that in polyamory, it's basically a type of non-monogamy where you are creating actual deeper emotional, one can say romantic, connections with multiple people, which is not the case for everyone, right? Like you mentioned, monogamish, which is a style where people are, largely, which once again is a Dan Savage term. I think you've had him on the podcast as well. Big fans of his. He's obviously, some of the things that we've come to over the years are things that we've obviously borrowed from him. Where monogamish is far more of a, yes, we are largely monogamous, but we're okay with each other occasionally, let's say, having, sex with someone else, right? But even that, there's some flexibility in those terms. And it's kind of one of the interesting things is when you come to non-monogamy, you end up having to spend time defining terms for yourself. And frankly, defining the core of your relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think is so important, because even monogamy people, actually that needs to be defined. Like, what are we talking about here? What are the agreements, and how are we allowed to use our energy with other people, et cetera? So in a way, polyamory, as you're describing it, it is like a container with boundaries, but there's agreements that are explicit about what's okay. Are there also agreements about what's not okay?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of like what is okay and what's not okay? Just a couple things that might, for people.
Yeah. Eugene, one of our actual relationship values is making the implicit explicit, and being very clear in those communications. For example, like one rule we've had for a long time is if we are in the same city together, we come home to each other. Like we all sleep at home together. So you could be out, hanging out with someone, having sex with someone, having a beautiful date, but like you will come home and we will wake up in the morning together. And that's not the case for other people who are practicing non-monogamy or polyamory, but for us, it's important. And it's kind of like a
Rika, why can you just unpack like why is that one? Why did you guys create that one? Why does that matter for you three?
Well, that's a very old rule. And at this point,
it's a bit of an artifact from earlier in the relationship, but that has almost has like now an emotional value to us. Yeah, you can talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to hear what you have to say about it as well. But like for me, it's a little bit like I don't have to wonder when you're coming home, which can sometimes be that little like anxiety-inducing thing. It's like, I know if I go to sleep, you're going to be here tomorrow morning. This is not going to be like a whole weekend escapade that you fall into. And that creates just like a little bit of safety and comfort in something that's a little bit less traditional.
Wow. Yeah. And so, because I think people have assumptions, judgments, or whatever about poly open people of like, you don't sort of care about the impact or something. And that feels really considerate. There's something that feels really, I can feel myself relax with that one. Like, oh, you're going to come back to me and to us. I don't know. I like it personally. It just sounds really nice.
Yeah. Like home is base camp in some way.
Yep.
It's interesting that you say that there's this assumption about, yes, people not being considerate and thinking of the other. And it's odd. I actually find it almost very much the opposite. We'll sometimes get a question like, and this is also coming into like rules or something, like people like, do your primary partners have like veto power over like who else you might date or see or something of that sort, right? And people ask us about like what rules and structures we have. And what I find is we don't have a lot of super strict rules and we don't have strict veto power. But I always ask them like, look, these are people who are your primary like relationships. You are always thinking about what's in their best interest, what's in their best emotional interest, right? And so I'm always like, well, why would I ever date someone who like Irka or James did not like? Like I don't need a veto power. I don't even need an exact rule on a lot of things like, oh, you can't do this, where we're constantly having conversations of how did this feel, right? Is this okay? Is everyone comfortable with this? And so in fact, you're constantly kind of being considerate of the needs of other people because you're not taking things for granted. You're not taking rules for granted.
Yeah, amazing. It feels like you kind of have to be, if you want to do it well here, you have to be very considerate. And would you say that in your experience with your monogamy friends over the years, and yourself when you were in that stage, do you feel like, in a way, you're communicating even more? And is it quote harder because you're communicating more?
Some ways harder, some ways easier. Like one of the things, like when you talk about non-monogamy, I think everyone thinks it's like all orgies, and most of non-monogamy is like deep emotional conversations and logistics discussions. That's what most of it is. You have to talk about everything to a level that most monogamous couples don't, because there are no assumptions. Like we're making it up as we go along. We're building the entire house from scratch. So there are a lot of deep conversations that happen on everything to a crazy degree.
Yeah.
It's a little bit kind of what you alluded to, yourself, Jayson, right? Like monogamous couples should be having these conversations, right? This is like kind of like one of our big shticks is like we never sell non-monogamy, but there's a lot of principles that end up being that you can't escape. You have to, like in non-monogamy, if you don't have honest and open conversation, if you're not getting in touch with your needs, if you're not getting values alignment, if you're not making a lot of these implicit things explicit, things are just going to instantly fall apart, right? Yeah. Like in monogamy, we all grow up with this template that we see, whether it's from mommy and daddy or on TV, and we all assume we know the roles we have to act out. And so we all show up and we're pretending to know what we're doing and we just phone it in. And we all know couples that have been together for decades and are miserable, but they're showing up and they're playing the role, like they've been told.
And that counts and that's success.
Right. And that can't work in non-monogamy because it's almost like too inherently unstable at first if you don't have those conversations, but because it forces you to have those conversations in a way, then once you kind of get over that hump, in a way, it almost becomes by default, like if you've made it past the hump, it almost becomes more stable because you're forced into that like complete honesty and openness and being more considerate and so forth.
Yeah.
So
the consistent theme that I've heard over the years working with people in open relationships has been, or non-monogamy folks, has been the kind of tenacity around communication. Like, God, we have to be so communicative and clear and open and honest. And I think monogamy, for whatever reason, people can be lazier and are lazy around their communication. And then they get into really bad habits because there's not really a third or fourth or whatever to navigate. I think just resonating with everything you're saying here.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of assumptions that you can fall back on, and some of them are very toxic and don't actually work for you. But you don't take the time to examine it. Well, one of the things, and so like Eugene and I actually started this like ethical monogamy project because we work with a lot of couples who are monogamous as well, but using the principles of non-monogamy and applying to it. And so one conversation that's very important to have in the beginning is like, what does cheating mean to you? Because cheating, by definition, is lying. And for most people, when you talk about when there's a rupture and someone cheated, it's often not the fucking, it's the lying. It's the fact that I now have to go revisit, the whole year and figure out like, oh, that time they said they were at work, they weren't. That time they said they were on a business trip, they weren't, right? It's the lying that makes the break. If you had sex with someone yesterday and you come home and tell your partner today, that is so much faster to repair. Even in a monogamous container, be like, I fucked up, I had a slip, I'm sorry, like, let's figure out how to avoid it in the future because we want to maintain our monogamous container. Let's figure out what caused it. Versus like, I've been having sex with someone for the last year, not telling you. That's gut-wrenching.
Well, and often it's not said like that. It's usually found out through an email they find, or, a text or a friend or someone.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. Let's talk about thirds for a minute. In Stan Tatkin's work, who my wife studies with a lot, and I've studied, he's been on the podcast many times. He talks a lot about securely attached relationships. And it's been cool to hear him talk about thirds in monogamy relationships being difficult. And thirds can mean just a child. It can mean a dog. It can mean a grandparent who's like living with them, moved in with them. It can mean a best friend that's just in their space all the time. Where jealousy comes up and all the things and the feelings and like, wait, who's the priority here? And some of the things I've learned over the years with polyamory, for example, is that usually there's a primary partnership and then there's a third that is sort of secondary, that knows that there's two primaries. And I'm curious how you guys work with that. Is that how it is for you in your relationship, or is it totally different than that? And describe it. So
there's a couple of, there's a couple of schools of thought on this. We actually, we have a bit of a rant on, I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of non-hierarchical, non-monogamy.
I've heard of it, but I don't tell us about it.
It's all the rage these days with the kids.
All the kids are doing it, right? Like solo poly and non-hierarchical. Everyone's, as it kind of alludes to, the idea is like there's no hierarchy, right, in my non-monogamous relationships, versus hierarchical non-monogamy would be, yes, I have like a primary and I have a secondary or secondaries, or just not as high of a priority in my life as my primary. And what essentially, we find that truly non-hierarchical non-monogamy is actually not impossible, but very difficult. And most people that are talking about it, right, they're not quite doing it. I mean, I think Irka often equates it to socialism, I think, right?
Perfect equality for all. I'm like, sure.
Good luck.
And yeah, exactly. And I'm like, it's a great concept. Like, if it was actually possible, I'm like, I'm down for it. But having been born in the Soviet Union, and I'm like, we tried it. It didn't work. Like, what we're doing with capitalism now does not work either. But like, there's some middle ground we could find that would be healthy for everybody. There's some kind of like fun middle. But yeah, one of the things that's really important to understand is that love is infinite and love grows. And love is like this truly endless pool. But time, money, energy, these are limited resources. And you have to decide how you allocate them among your relationships every day. And when you're talking about thirds, it's saying like some of that resource, right? Whether it's time or attention or whatever it is going to this third and not to me.
And
right.
So what we found, and this is kind of like, what we find often is why we say that all the kids are doing this is kind of like, people have this concept of non-hierarchical. I often like reference a date I went on with a woman once, and she was like, yeah, I'm really into non-hierarchical, non-monogamy. We're talking a bit. She'd mentioned her boyfriend, and I'm like, cool. And I'm like, oh, do you and your boyfriend live together? It's like, no, we don't. He lives with his wife and their 2 kids. But, I see him at least once a week. And I'm like, tell me more about this non-hierarchical thing, right? And so it often does not happen. What we do find, and what we've had in our own experience, right? Like, what does make it much easier is, for example, something like cohabitation. So like having in some way kind of like dumped on non-hierarchical, non-monogamy, the reality of our relationship, and you might have noticed me referencing it this way before, I talk about my primary partners, not my primary partner, right? And so obviously Irka and I have been together for, 2 decades. With James, it's been only almost 1 decade, right? And so that skew becomes smaller and smaller every year, right? And so as time has gone on, yes, the 3 of us very much like a triangle relationship where the 3 of us are family, right? And so there really isn't much of hierarchy there. But even then, we have to be realistic. There's still some difference. Like Irka and I have a longer history, right? We've had an extra decade of time together that we spend before we met James, and that does create a slight difference in the balance. But with almost a decade of living together, that slowly starts to even out. Okay. So in those cases where you're all living together, I think it's easier to get there. It's a lot harder for people who are like actually managing multiple, like largely separated relationships at the same time.
Yeah.
Because we find it hard to actually accomplish.
In that case where that you're managing someone outside the home, let's say you 2 are living together and James was off in an apartment somewhere, it kind of, wouldn't Irka be your primary partner, Eugene?
Yeah.
In that example.
Exactly.
But you guys are trying to, I'm hearing that over time, you're trying to live into non-hierarchical, non-monogamy. Is that accurate?
Not really trying. It just happened.
It's just happening over time.
It just happened. Yeah. And it happened especially. So when we started dating, James actually moved to Germany to run a biotech fund a month after I met him. And the first part of our relationship was long distance, which in some ways made the relationship possible. But like the 3 of us would travel together. Like we went kite surfing in Dakla, and we went and had New Year's in Hamburg where James was living. And at that time, it was very clear, like me and Eugene had the primary relationship, and then me and James had the secondary relationship, and Eugene and James had this like weird friendship relationship through me. At this point, the 3 of us are a family. Yeah. And there is no, like, it has very much collapsed into one relationship. After James moved back from Germany and we melded together during the pandemic in our apartment in Brooklyn.
Okay. Yeah, so we've been living together for about 5 years now.
The 3 of you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And do you all have one bed?
Yes.
We get this question often. Yeah. So it's I'm gonna do a bit of a plug for someone. Kat will appreciate this, but so it's a king and a half bed. The way we make this work is it's a king mattress plus a twin XL. They make these sets, which is a strap and a little bridge for putting 2 twin XLs together into a king. But if you get a big enough strap, you can strap it together into a throuple bed. And there's this great company called Attitude with an E, right? They make these great eco-friendly bamboo sheets, which we've been using for years. And if you email them, they will make you throuple sheets custom to fit like a throuple bed.
Nice. Yeah. Okay.
Separate comforters. Key to happiness in a throuple.
Oh my God, yes.
Separate comforters.
The Europeans have this, right? Like we were like skiing together in Austria like 7 years ago or something like that. And we all got our own comforter and my mind was blown. I'm like, Europeans have been doing this forever. Don't tug for the blanket. Everyone gets their own comforter. This is very important.
They're all big enough that the three of us can snuggle under one if we're like snuggling or whatever, but then go into our separate corners and get some sleep.
Yes.
Yeah. And is it, I mean, my naive assumption here is Irka's in the middle, or does it rotate? Does it matter?
It depends. Yeah, it kind of rotates around. Originally, in the beginning, yes, Irka would primarily be in the middle. And I'd say she still probably is in the middle kind of the largest chunk of the time. But we really do kind of just like move around, right? It very much has become much more of a relationship.
I'm also a huge proponent of separate sleeping. Like I need my alone time and I need my separate time. So sometimes I go to sleep on my own, but they don't like sleeping alone. So they end up sleeping together and snuggling while I'm in a different room. And this is something that is also like one of those, even in monogamous couples, like something to negotiate. Like, do you actually like sleeping in a bed together? Do you like sleeping in a bed together every night? And I have some friends who aren't doing that. And it's a huge relief for some people to be like either some of the time or all the time. Like we have separate bedrooms and we come together for sex and snuggling in some way. But yeah, it kind of rotates. Like at this point, it's all very fluid.
And is everybody having sex with everybody and going through phases? Is that sort of? So
we are all straight, which is unusual for a polyamory setup.
Yeah, that's probably the...
So James and Eugene are not having sex?
Correct. I mean, we'll have sex together with other people like Irka or other partners. But yeah, that's almost probably the most kind of like the part of our relationship that I think is hardest for a lot of people to understand. I'll often refer, like I refer to James as my boyfriend, right? And I sometimes worry that people are going to get the wrong idea and then I'll be shamed for not being gay enough. And I love the fact that we live in a society where I get to worry about that, about someone finding out that, wait, he called a dude his boyfriend, but he's actually straight.
How does that work? Yeah.
I always say, I wish I was bi. It would be double the pleasure, double the fun. Like I'm serious, it's something I've like obviously considered and explored, but I also kind of understand where my own like urges and desires lie. But I refer to James and myself as being homosensual, right? We're very affectionate. We're very cuddly, right? We're very loving. Yes, like Irka can sleep in a different bed. Like I'll spoon him and pet his back to get him to fall asleep, right? Like there's a lot of touching. It's been an interesting experience because, as I'm sure Jayson, so many of us men especially grow up with a big homophobic and nudity taboos that
that's not okay. No way.
Yeah. And so, but we grew up in that, right? Yeah. And so this experience has been like really great with, melting a lot of that away.
That's so cool.
But yeah, I mean, this is, James and I are both straight, but we do consider each other, like we think of each other like he's my boyfriend, I'm his boyfriend. And that was an interesting, dynamic switch at first as well, because, I would talk about him as Irka's boyfriend in the beginning of the relationship, it'd be like my wife's boyfriend or my girlfriend's boyfriend. And with time, we use these labels to communicate as much information as possible in as little time as possible. And it became far more important for me to communicate that, hey, this is a man that I love and adore and is a core part of my family. That became far more important to communicate than what we aren't doing with each other's penises.
Yeah.
And a lot of asexual people understand this immediately, and it's so easy. And like everyone else is very confused by it, which we find interesting.
How does that work? And men especially, we're so up against so much deep conditioning around this. So thanks, Eugene, for being like, I love the melting away at all that bullshit. So you can just be yourself and do what you want to do,
Yeah. And I really love, like, if I walk into a room and they're cuddling and hugging, it like melts my soul. It's one of the most beautiful things to see them loving on each other in this safe, beautiful, moving way every time. I'm like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah. And what's cool about you three, again, is the assumption often is, especially for a guy, is, well, cool, if I'm going to be in an open relationship, it's two women and me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Because I'm so homophobic, basically.
The 14-year-old in you comes out and is like, threesome, right? Yeah, we've all
that's
we've
the
all gone
college
through
sort
that.
of dream. Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, quick interruption here. If you're in pain relationally and you need immediate support, our coaches can help you. I've trained almost 100 coaches at this point, relationship coaches that are amazing humans, and they have the chops to help you get through this hard time, this hard moment you're going through. Or if you want to actually hire a coach and have someone in your corner to continue to up-level your communication skills, your listening skills, your conflict skills, these folks are incredible. Okay. So all you need to do is go to relationshipschool.com/MRC. That stands for My Relationship Coach. So relationshipschool.com/MRC. All right. If you want immediate, direct, effective help, check them out. Hey there. Every week I send out an email toward the end of the week giving you a tip or a pointer on personal growth, psychology, communication, and of course, relationships. If you want to receive that, go to relationshipschool.com/newsletter and make sure you're on my list so that I can send you these emails. I think they're awesome, high quality content coming your way. I want to come back to something you said, Irka, about love, kind of limitless, boundless. A lot of, in my experience over the years, again, working with more personal growth oriented people, spiritual people, there's a way in which people use something like that. They say, well, I'm not into monogamy because that's not love. That's like possession, and I own you and you need to like check in with me and we have expectations of each other and yada, yada. And love is way bigger than that. And to justify themselves sleeping around, essentially. How do you guys think about this? Because there's people listening right now that are actually considering an arrangement like yours. And I want them to do it, like, obviously really responsibly and not use all the terms to then justify their own sort of predatory behavior or their own bullshit acting out. So how would you talk to those people when they are saying, well, love knows no bounds and you shouldn't have agreements essentially and whatever?
Yeah, any healthy relationship is going to have boundaries. Like, that's the basis of anything that's worth doing to me. The interesting thing in non-monogamy is you get to explicitly define those boundaries with your partner. And I know exactly the types of people that you're talking about. I almost think of them as like non-monogamy bros, where it's just like you want to have an easier time of like acting out your avoidant attachment while making fewer excuses or whatever it is. And so you're using this label in a way that's quite toxic, unfortunately. Whereas like the real thing you should be doing is like, you need to go examine your attachment wounds with a trusted person, whether with a friend or the therapist or a coach, and then come back to this and see if it's actually a fit. But yeah, love is boundless, but love does not mean that you get to hurt other people. You need to examine what their needs are, what your needs are, and what is the right container for you guys to be in together. Because even though we're polyamorous, even though it's three of us, we have a very clearly defined, discussed, explicit container that the three of us exist in. And we redefine it and adjust it and widen that container or narrow it as
based on whatever's happening. Yeah.
Exactly. As our life evolves, as our need evolve, as we heal some things but break others. We literally had a big rupture with Eugene this past fall and had to narrow the container for a little bit. Like, we all expect that we will open it up again. But for the time being, we're having way more explicit conversations that we were not having 2 years ago, because we know we're in the midst of a repair of a rupture.
Yeah, cool. Wow. Thanks for that. And can you, since we're there, obviously you guys have good communication around conflict repair and rupture repair, and you know how to do that. being together 20 years and you're still, in a great relationship.
Wouldn't have made it this far without it.
Exactly. I don't know how people fucking do it. They just fall asleep. But
I'm out.
How often, just again for the listener, I think, on my own curiosity, of course, how often are you going outside the throuple to explore something? Is that like a once in 5 years, or is that once a month? Is that just for people to kind of get a sense of that?
It really varies, right? Like one, it's changed. It changes over time, right? There's a lot of like there's an ebb and flow, right? We came to non-monogamy in a fairly like slow and organic sort of way. So for us, like it was a fairly slow on-ramp initially. But even once I would say like we were already in it, right? There have been all kinds of periods, right? There were periods of like deep sexual exploration where like, like I think there was a week where like, like not saying this is great, but we like, it's not actually the case, but I almost like jokingly say like we competed, right? Like I think, yes, like I think Irka slept with like 6 people. I slept with 5 or 7 and 6, whatever it was. The point was she won, right? But like there's periods like that. And there's periods where we're not, we're not seeing anyone. And at the same time, there's also more of with time, I think, we have more longer term partners, right? So we have a few kind of like, call them like lovers or partners that like have been part of our, if not our family, but our tribe, right? For also 6, 7, 8 years, right?
Wow.
And those relationships they're like, these are the people that show up for Thanksgiving dinner, right? We're also not always having sex with them.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are, right? Sometimes we're not. So
sometimes they get into monogamous relationships and we have to pause, and sometimes those relationships last and sometimes they don't, and then they come back and things just kind of flow back and forth.
Yeah.
So the answer is it's really varied from just like, once every 6 months to like a few times a week, right? And it's really changed with where we are individually in our lives. And it's different for each one of us. Like Irka, I often joke, but like Irka is largely duogamous. It's like our version of monogamy, but Irka hasn't really dated or been sexually involved with anyone other than James and myself for years. It's funny because we always sometimes forget. We almost start thinking of her as being monogamous, and then we're like, "Oh shit, she sleeps in a bed with 2 dudes every night." So I guess it's monogamous by most other people's standards. But we're like, "Oh, what are you talking about? Irka's monogamous. She hasn't slept with anyone in ages." Oh, us.
I haven't had an interest. Like for me, for example, my sex drive really goes up and down. And I had long COVID during COVID, and then I had a long depression. And it's like through healing that depression that I got to the work that I do now. And as I've recovered, like I'm just not that interested in going out and doing the dating thing right now.
Yeah.
Just it's so much time and it's so much energy. And I'm like, I'm way more interested in like learning a new somatic therapeutic modality than I am in like being at a bar with someone at 8 p.m. So I am less interested in it now. I would not be surprised if in a year or 5 or 10, my sex drive does something else. And I'm like, this is the only thing I'm excited to do. Whereas Eugene has a pretty stable interest in both meeting new people and a high sex drive. So he's way more likely to be out there at, polyamory events or on dating apps. And James is kind of in the middle. And he, sometimes has an interest, sometimes has less. And James's like number one priority in his life is his work. And he's so committed to this mission of longevity and life extension, where for him, funny enough, one of the benefits of being in a polyamorous relationship is he doesn't have to do the dating thing. Eugene can do the dating thing and introduce him to an interesting, attractive, like woman.
He's got a great deal. I got a pretty good deal too. I always say I'm like every straight man should get a boyfriend, right? I don't think most guys are considering this. It's such a hack. So many benefits, really. Like
that's great.
I mean, it really is. But I'm the extrovert in the bunch, so I enjoy going out on dates and meeting new people. That being said, the last couple of years, it's actually probably been more, like a few longer term partners, some people that have been in our lives for years. And then like, let's say like a relationship here or there that might like last a year or something of that sort. Right. Sometimes I get spikes where I'm like, you know what? I really want to go out and I want to be dating. Right. So.
Cool.
Yep.
All right. As we start to slowly wind down, I got a few more here questions for you. So I want to come back to the listener again and some people who are thinking about this because I've worked with so many people over the years who are like, well, I'm just not sure I'm into monogamy. And that's kind of, they're butting up against something. And my response as over the years has grown into something like this. And I want to get feedback on my response. On some coaching here. I'm always like, look, I see this whole open, because they always say, what do you think, Jayson? And I say, look, I think it's kind of like the animal kingdom, where there's some animals that are into monogamy for life, and there's some that are not. And we're like a huge species, human beings, and some of us are into monogamy and some of us are not. And you gotta ultimately find what's true for who you are. Because I'm not saying you should do this, right? It's not some dogma here. What do you think of that response? And then how do you talk to a person who's having a hard time with monogamy and they want to try this, but their partner's resistant? Like, how do we start to get into those conversations?
Yeah, the analogy I often use when people are like, oh, should I do monogamy or non-monogamy or whatever it is? Like, which one's better? And part of the things that we have to realize is that we live in a very monogamous society. Like, we are marinated
for sure.
in it.
Yeah.
Like, it's literally permeated everything to a degree that we don't even realize. And so my answer is kind of like, if monogamy works for you, go for it, because your life will be easy. Like, if you can make it work, I like all the power to you. The issue becomes when it doesn't. And like, the analogy I use there is that there's no right way to cook, let's say, right? Like, you have had a recipe, let's say, passed down from like your grandmother to your mother to you. And some people are like, I'm going to take that recipe and I'm going to make it exactly that way. Like, it's a little too salty for me and I don't like paprika, but it's a family tradition and like, I can put up with it and it's fine. And I can eat this soup every week and it's fine. And there's some other people who are like, I'm going to tweak it just a little bit, right? Like, maybe once a year, the two of us go to a sex party, right? Or like, maybe I'm allowed to go dancing with the girls or something else. Like, there's like a small tweak to the relationship to accommodate for some needs. And some other people are like, I'm just going to go to the grocery store, buy whatever the fuck I want and cook my own soup.
Yeah.
That's going to be perfectly to my taste and to my flavor. And that is nearly impossible for some people to do. Like, I can't do that. I can barely follow a recipe. So to me, it's like, where do you fit on that spectrum? And then the other question to ask is like, what problems do you want to be solving? Because becoming non-monogamous doesn't mean all of your problems go away. Becoming non-monogamous means you trade one set of problems for another set of problems. It's like corporate life versus entrepreneurship. Like, sure, you think one is better than the other, but for most of us who've tried both, there are pluses and minuses. And so you have to be very aware of what your needs are, do a lot of self-examination, and then say, what problems do I want to be solving at this point in my life?
And I think the important caveat to end also, I think, well, Irka kind of hit it, at this point in my life. I think this is one of these things where people are just come at it and say like, like monogamy is not for me, or I can only do monogamy, right? But the reality it is, you might like one type of soup at one moment, right? And, it might no longer sit well with you in 10 years, right? Or you may want to try something else. And so that's the other part of the dynamic that I think a lot of people miss. I don't think it's, I don't think it's the same as with a lot of things where it's just like, I am this way, right? A lot of people think they are, and they say, oh, I could never do non-monogamy, right? The reality it is like, you're just saying that based on like the template you grew up with, right? If it was something that you were really to look at and find out, okay, well, why are you even saying that, right? Like, I'm not saying you have to explore it, but there's probably reasons. There's templates that you've learned. There's attachment wounds that you're probably adjusting for. There's a lot going on there, right? And the same in the other direction. We know people who've gone, like non-monogamous that have closed up relationships, right? So I think that's an important factor to consider as well. And which comes back to like the core of it is just like that, making that implicit explicit, is having those conversations and having those conversations with yourself, right? Like getting in touch with what your needs are. We're so bad as individuals often with like getting in touch with what the needs of ourselves are individually, let alone as a couple. and bringing that to the table. It's like we never, like I would say, like we never sell non-monogamy, but we sell honest conversations, right? Like if you can have a conversation, whether both at the start of your relationship and 5 or 10 years in, and be like, hey, should we be, like I'm thinking about non-monogamy. Should we do it? Should we not do it? And you can come to a decision on that, but you can have that conversation. That's a beautiful thing. That's a sign of a healthy relationship, right? If you're walking around and saying like, oh, honey, I'm not attracted to anyone other than you. I only like you. You are the most beautiful human in the world. I would never, right? And then in reality, most likely probably doing something that your spouse would not approve of or does not know about. That's what you're trying to avoid, whether you're going monogamous or not monogamous.
Yeah.
So the short answer is definitely when people come to us with that question, the first thing is like, let's do an exploration as to what's not working about non-monogamy. Like, what is it like? Yeah. Or monogamy, like what's not working about monogamy for you that you want to go explore this other way. And then go from there.
Yeah.
Because
I was going to say,
often,
go ahead.
Often, and this is probably a lot of what you're seeing, Jayson, is often people are going to non-monogamy to solve a problem that does not get solved with non-monogamy.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
exactly.
It's like people who have kids to fix their relationship.
Exactly. It's like it's having a child to fix the marriage or something of that sort, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same
Open
thing.
up to fix
your
the marriage
relationship
is
has
not gonna
problems,
work.
and now you're going to open it up. Like,
No.
you're in for a wild ride. That's not going to be pleasant, right? Like,
you're pouring gasoline on the fire.
Exactly.
Already.
It's the diametric opposite. You want to be coming from like a stable, strong, like securely attached like relationship, right? And then building on that security and saying, hey, can we add some flexibility, right? Not the other way around.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, both of you, because it's, again, I do see that, Eugene, where people have basic communication problems they can't repair, for example, and they think opening it up is going to somehow allow them to repair more. I'm like, no, that's just going to get you some dopamine for a couple of months, and then you're going to be right back where you started with your lack of repair problem.
A lot
it's going to get harder for you. Yeah.
Because you're going to hurt each other in a whole variety of new ways that there are no societal templates for repair. And like one of the things you mentioned, like the dopamine part, is one of the other very foundational things for people starting non-monogamy is, do you know the difference between love and sex, affection and infatuation? Like, can you separate those two in your mind? If love and sex and affection and infatuation, like if that whole thing is one thing for you, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
And for so many people, it's all one giant bucket, even though the hormones involved are completely different. And the other thing we also really recommend for people who want to try this is at some point, spend some amount of time, and the rough recommendation is a year, but you got to choose your own adventure. Just the two of you. Like, let the love hormones build up and have the hard conversations, create the patterns of repair, build the communication, and then open up from a place of safety and stability and consent from both parties, like enthusiastic consent from both parties.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and I just wanted to add to your love sex thing. There's also a big difference between love and attachment that people don't understand.
Yes, exactly.
They think they conflate the two, and that's a huge problem. Okay, final parting words here, just from each of you about if, again, people are thinking about this, or I'm really inspired over here because Eugene, you and I have talked for years about this, and I had a sense that just there was a tremendous amount of health here and just wisdom, and that's totally true in this moment and in my experience, and it's really refreshing. So thanks for blazing a trail for others to do this part of their lives differently and well, if they can be true to themselves. So parting words here that you might want to say to folks, and then we'll talk about if people want to follow up with you.
I think, there's so much, but the truth is, I think we've said it a couple of times, that kind of making the implicit explicit has kind of become like our tagline, and it's one of our core relationship values, right? It's that, as cliche as it is, right? So much of relationship is about good communication, right? It applies to monogamous. It applies to non-monogamous. I mean, this is why, like we mentioned, like, like we've created this, like the ethical monogamy project, because like at the end of the day, right, like it's really the same core principles that create a healthy relationship one way or the other, right? Like when we're having a conversation with someone about this, and like, the framework we'd come to is like, if you're looking to open up your monogamous relationship, your relationship should be in a place where having a conversation about potentially opening it up doesn't feel like a threat or a negative thing, right? And if it's not there, there are going to be some stumbling blocks.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And I highly, highly, highly encourage people to turn the light of their attention inward and do a lot of self-examination. Like, how much of the monogamy marinade has penetrated you? If you want to try this, it's going to be work to get that out of your system in some way, whether in solo work or in your partnership work, before it's possible. And truly, truly understand for yourself what your needs are, understand what your partner's needs are, and understand how to create a unique container that meets them in a healthy, honest, beautiful way.
Amazing. Okay, 2 more questions. Last one for just sort of, I asked all podcast guests this, because I'm on a mission to help a lot of people with this part of their lives. And I have a affinity for high schoolers and young people. And so if we were all sitting in a high school auditorium with 1,000 kids, and you could only share, each of you could share one thing about love and relationships, what would you say to this group of kids?
I think my main lesson for high school kids would be learning to understand those differences between in love, infatuation, love, and attachment. Because I think that's one of it's one of a couple, but one of the biggest disservices that I think we do in terms of how we educate people. The fact that, any movie you watch, any book you read, like start with Romeo and Juliet. The fact that we give kids Romeo and Juliet and say that this is an example of love is a disaster, right? We are talking about like a horrifically toxic relationship, right? Like where everyone like where people die, right? And we're like, this is love. You are my Juliet and I will be your Romeo. I'm like, please don't, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that understanding, like one of the big stumbling blocks, obviously, for adolescence is, like you got your hormones raging, right? You're like, you're lusty, right? At bare minimum, you're in love at like secondary. And most of the time they're calling it love, right? And just having that understanding that, hey, being in lust and being in love and that new relationship energy, it's great. Enjoy it, right? Have fun with it, right? Approach it safely, but understand what it is and don't conflate it with the fact that like it's the same thing as having built like having created secure attachment, having created commitment, having built this strong relationship that love actually is. Love is something that's built over time. And know where what role each one of those plays and what role it can play in your life. So that'd be my core lesson.
Great. Irka?
Yeah. This brings me back to my high school days. I've been binge watching Sex and the City, which was like the show when I was in high school and college. And looking at it now through like a coaching therapeutic lens, I'm like, oh my God, this is what we were sold as the perfect it's frankly hard to watch. But yeah, one of the most important things, it's like how much of that is permeated in my brain, right? One of the most important things is about love to understand is that you don't necessarily choose who you're attracted to, but you do choose who you love, because you choose who you spend your time with, you choose who you invest your energy into, you choose who you pay attention to. And so you might be attracted to some asshole, or you might be attracted to someone who's hurt you, and that's okay. And that's like the lust hormones going crazy. That's fine. But you don't have to choose to put your time and energy into them. You can put your time and energy into someone you're still attracted to, but maybe a little bit less.
Yeah.
and build a really deep, loving relationship with them. And it is a choice. And it's something that we're sold as not a choice. It's like, oh, you don't choose. Like, you do. You absolutely, absolutely choose who you love.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, last question is, where do people follow up if they want to work with you guys or find out more about you?
So there's more about us, or if they want to sign up, we actually do free starter intro sessions to get to know people, to see if we're a good fit, because we're not a great fit for everyone. But you're basically going to www.covalent.life.
Covalent.life. Yep. Spell covalent.
Those are great questions. Now I got to spell it. Covalent is COVALENT. So like covalent bonds. And that's a whole nother stick we go into that. Yeah, like covalent bonds have a lot to teach us. If anyone remembers that part of chemistry, which God knows I don't, but James, PhD in biology, so he was so he brought this up initially and came up with a name. But yeah, a lot of the connections in those bonds have a lot to teach us about creating great relationships. So it's covalent.life. Yeah, and we're also, the other thing mentioned that we're working on is the ethical monogamy project, and that's ethicalmonogamy.com. And we're kind of coming out with some discussions, articles, and exercises for people to work on to kind of explore how we can do monogamy better. How can we take some of the lessons that can't be avoided in non-monogamy, right, and brought back into monogamy.
Love it. You guys, thanks so much. Seriously, it's a breath of fresh air to have people doing polyamory well. So thanks for being an inspiration to us.
Yeah. Thank you, Jayson, for having us.
Yep.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thanks a lot, man.
Hey, y'all. I hope you have ordered my new book by now, Getting to Zero, How to Work Through Conflict in Your High-Stakes Relationships. It's already getting dozens of 5-star reviews on Amazon. I've heard from a lot of you. Thank you for buying the book, buying it on Audible, buying it on Kindle. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate the support. I think this book is going to help a lot of people. It's all about how do we get back to a good place after some kind of disconnection or rupture or conflict. That's what the entire book is about. And if you want a roadmap on how to get back to a good place, what I call zero, please order my book. GettingToZeroBook.com. Get you some extra goodies, a conflict quiz, some additional PDFs, etc. And you can order it in all the places and support your local bookstores.